Many people find the idea of a circus freak show distasteful in the 21st century. But that certainly wasn't the case in the 19th century, which for all its technological progress was an era still firmly rooted in the past. A past in which people didn't travel and didn't experience the world, unless it was brought to them. An era before the internet, before television, before movies, an era in which most people couldn't even read. This was the heyday of the travelling circus. In England alone there were hundreds of them, from small, scrappy little troupes earning a hand-to-mouth existence in the shires to huge travelling shows that drew in enormous crowds. And one of the attractions people came to see was the sideshow. Giants, dwarfs, bearded ladies, albinos, Siamese twins, and living skeletons. Welcome to Insane History. I'm Dr. Graeme Yorston, and today I'm exploring the lives of these so-called anatomical wonders. Men like Claude-Ambroise Seurat, Isaac Sprague, John Coffey, and Peter Robinson, and women like Miss Emma Schaller. To try to understand the psychological impact of being so different, so stared at, so exploited, but for a few, so famous. Our story begins in France with the man usually regarded as the first celebrity thin man, Claude-Ambroise Seurat. Born in the ancient city of Troyes, just after the French Revolution in 1798, Seurat initially appeared to be perfectly normal. At 10, he was described as being as healthy as any other child, apart from having a sunken chest. But by the age of 14, his frame had dwindled away to skeleton form. We don't know much about his early life, but he achieved fame in France, with 1,500 people paying to see him in one day alone in Rouen. He came to London in 1825 to be exhibited as the living skeleton at the Chinese Gallery in Pall Mall. The public flocked to see him, at a cost of £half a crown, a day's wages at the time. His bodily dimensions were extraordinary. Although he was of full height, standing 5 feet 7 inches or 170 centimetres tall, he weighed a mere 78 pounds or 35 kilograms. His arm circumference was just 4 inches, and his waist measured less than 24 inches around. The Cruikshank brothers, George and Robert, famous for their biting caricatures of Georgian society, went to see him and were quick to incorporate his unique form into their work, mocking the respectable ladies who came to stare at the near-naked Frenchman. He was examined by eminent surgeon and anatomist Sir Astley Cooper, who noted his short, broad neck and several skeletal abnormalities, including deformed shoulder blades and a deeply sunken chest which displaced his heart. The leading medical journal of the day, The Lancet, accused the public of having a rabid curiosity and opined that the exploitation was one of the most impudent and disgusting attempts to make a profit from the public appetite for novelty by an indecent exposure of human suffering and degradation which we have ever witnessed. But the public couldn't get enough of him. There was even a play written about him. And Seurat himself denied that he was being exploited and publicly thanked his protectors for rendering him sufficiently independent to live at ease. To the medical men of the day, he was a living textbook of anatomy. His skin was so thin and his muscle mass so depleted that observers could see his heart beating, and his waist was said to resemble a wasp's. Part of the attraction for visitors was that they were allowed to touch Monsieur Seurat in his state of almost complete nudity. The following year, he was back in France, appearing at a circus in Bordeaux, where he was seen by the 82-year-old Spanish painter Francisco Goya, living in self-imposed exile. Goya had a lifelong fascination for the unusual and darker side of humanity, which had not been diminished by old age, and he made a charcoal drawing of Seurat as part of a series of circus sketches. As you may have guessed, I like books. New books, old books, French books, ancient Greek books. Which is why I'm delighted to introduce today's sponsor, Hungry Minds, publisher of The Book. Described as the ultimate guide to rebuilding a civilization, I have to confess I wasn't quite sure what to expect. It turns out it's an illustrated encyclopedia of everything from beekeeping to X-rays. 400 pages of intriguing topics. Some you'd expect, airplanes for example. Others are more surprising, like insects for food. As someone who has always been interested in history, I love the pictures. They have a steampunk quality that really brings the subjects to life. It's beautifully produced with quality paper, and on every page you'll find something interesting. Oh look, there's Sigmund Freud. It's an ideal gift for people looking for something a little different. Follow the link in the description below and use the promotional code Professor10 to get a 10% discount. Contemporary physicians considered Seurat's emaciation to be due to obliteration of the lacteal vessels and mesenteric glands, causing malabsorption. But in fact he had problems with swallowing and was only able to eat tiny amounts of food, which had to be cut up very small and masticated thoroughly. 1 penny roll of 3 ounces or 70 grams only, with a little wine. Modern theories are that he may have been the earliest recorded case of Sprengel's deformity, an inherited shoulder abnormality caused by a failure of the scapula to descend from the neck during early fetal development. This can occur alone or as part of the more extensive skeletal malformations of Klippel-Feil syndrome. It's not known for certain how long he lived. His last recorded appearance was in 1833 in Dinan in Brittany, which would have made him 35. But one account suggests that after his death, a giant 15-foot-long tapeworm was discovered in his intestines, and that this would have explained his abnormal thinness. But half the population of Europe had tapeworms at this time, and few of them looked like poor Claude-Ambroise Seurat. Perhaps the most famous of all the living skeletons was the American performer Isaac W. Sprague. Born in 1841 in East Bridgewater, Massachusetts, Isaac was a normal, healthy child. But at the age of 12, after a day of swimming, he got a cramp and complained of feeling ill. He then began to lose weight, rapidly and alarmingly. His parents called in a succession of doctors, but none could work out the cause of his thinness, although many suggested ineffectual cures. He tried to live a normal life, working in his father's shoemaking business, and later with his father as a grocer. But as his weight dropped further, he had no strength, and it became increasingly difficult to keep up with the physical demands of working. When his parents died, he had to find a way to support himself, and in 1865 a touring carnival owner spotted Sprague and offered him a job. He was initially reluctant. The idea of being put on display went against his nature, but with no other options he accepted, becoming the original Thin Man, and his life revolved around the touring sideshow circuit. The following year, having accepted the lifestyle, he became more ambitious and travelled to New York to meet the legendary showman P.T. Barnum, who offered him a place in his American museum at $80 a week, a huge sum when the average wage was around $2 a day. On a trip to Boston, he was examined by Dr. Oliver Wendell Holmes. Nowadays, Holmes is better known for his literary work, but he was a prominent physician, medical reformer, and professor at Harvard Medical School, as well as a writer. Holmes spent time studying in France and was an early advocate for evidence-based medicine, and he lectured on quackeries and medical fallacies, into which category he firmly included homeopathy. Holmes diagnosed Sprague as suffering from excessive progressive muscular atrophy. In 1868, Barnum's museum burnt down, and Sprague barely escaped with his life. He married Tamar Moore, and together they had 3 healthy sons who never developed their father's condition. Sprague found immense happiness in his family, once stating in a pitch booklet, "Life that had at times seemed so little worth preserving, now seemed more precious." However, although he earned a good living, Sprague had a gambling problem, which forced him back into working for Barnum time and again to pay off his debts and support his family. At the age of 44, Sprague stood 5 feet 6 inches tall and weighed just 43 pounds, less than 20 kilograms. He needed a constant intake of small amounts of food and drink to prevent him passing out, and he usually wore a flask of sweetened milk around his neck, which he would sip throughout the day. In his pocket, he always kept a note, explaining his condition and assuring people he wasn't starving, homeless, or consumptive, just born into a body that wouldn't hold weight. It was his shield against judgment, disdain, or the well-meaning interference of strangers. But the strain eventually took its toll. Unable to clear his lungs, he died of pneumonia in poverty at the age of 45 in Chicago in 1887. It's rumoured that he made a final bet on his own death, wagering $250 that he wouldn't live past Saturday. He died and won the bet, but whether anyone was able to collect his winnings is unknown. John Coffey was born a healthy child in Piqua, Ohio in 1852. He worked as a barber in Cedar Rapids, married a school teacher, and had 7 children. But at the age of 29, he began to lose weight. He stood 5 feet 7 inches tall, but withered away to just 70 pounds or 31 kilograms. Aware of the popularity of Isaac Sprague, he began to exhibit himself in Chicago dime museums, appearing shirtless in front of gawping crowds. His show, such as it was, initially consisted of him simply displaying himself to the masses. But he was keen to add a little more value, more entertainment, more class to the performance. So he had some figure-hugging 3-piece suits made, with vertical stripes to accentuate his leanness, sported a monocle, expensive hats and a pocket watch, and rebranded himself as a dapper young gentleman, a dandy, or dude as the word was used at the time, and he quickly became very famous as the Skeleton Dude. He was quick-witted and could turn on the charm, and in each town he visited he would announce in the newspapers that he was going to pick a bride from anyone who cared to apply. A plump and pleasing person was what he was looking for. Dozens of legitimate proposals would pour in, and he would appear to inspect them all before eventually choosing one and going through a wedding ceremony. The wife he was already married to, Mary. The entire stunt was repeated in the next town, and the next, and the next. Sometimes he would turn up the heat a little by having the family of the bride object to the union and cause a furore at the wedding. At other times, he would pretend to marry a skeleton woman, notching up at least 20 marriages to Miss Emma Schaller, or to a professional fat lady, including the 556-pound Gertie Platt at least once. In 1889, he joined the Barnum and Bailey Circus on its extended 5-year tour of Europe, travelling around the continent on a 70-wagon train. He was one of the chief attractions, selling souvenir photos wherever he went. But in 1905, when he was 53 years old, his career was ended by a fall and injury to his legs that restricted his mobility and resulted in him putting on weight. He tried alternative ways of making a living, giving lectures about his life and as a palm reader. But a fire the same year destroyed most of his belongings, and his wife, Mary, that he had married so very many times left him. Sadly, his final years were spent in poverty, reliant on the charity of others, and he died a pauper in 1912. Although the heyday of the sideshow was undoubtedly in the 19th century, the Living Skeleton Act persisted well into the 20th. One fascinating figure from this later era was Peter Robinson. Born in Massachusetts in 1874, he lived a long and seemingly happy life, passing away in 1947 at the age of 73. Robinson had a normal appearance until his early teens, when his weight began to drop rapidly. By the age of 21, when he first went on exhibition at Coney Island, he weighed just 58 pounds or 26 kilograms. He later joined the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus, sometimes appearing under the stage name The Cigarette Fiend. Unlike Sprague and some of the other living skeletons, Robinson was somewhat stronger in constitution. He had full mobility and didn't require a constant intake of nutrients, and he was described by his peers as a very friendly, jovial person. Robinson fully embraced the sideshow marketing machine. He was involved with at least 8 fat ladies throughout his career, staging theatrical marriages over and over again in the various towns they passed through, until he got married for real to Helen Baby Bunny Smith, who weighed in at 467 pounds, with whom he had 2 children. He toured extensively around North and South America, but perhaps his greatest claim to fame was his appearance in the 1932 film Freaks. Controversial even when it was made, and considered no more than tawdry exploitation, such that it was banned in many countries, some now regard it as a masterpiece for its sympathetic portrayal of the performers and for its important inclusivity message, at a time when the eugenics movement was a powerful force. Robinson at least got to show off his musical skills. He was a talented harmonica player who would frequently serenade the cast between takes. Robinson stands out as a rare example of a skeleton man performer who managed to navigate the exploitative pitfalls of the industry and maintain a relatively normal, fulfilling existence. There were dozens of living skeletons in the circuses and fairgrounds of Europe and America in the 19th century. But they were nearly always men. There were plenty of fat ladies, but very few thin women, possibly because the underlying medical conditions suffered by the men were X-linked genetic disorders, due to defective genes on the X chromosome, which men have only a single copy of, whilst women have 2. One exception was Emma Schaller, who was perfectly sound and healthy until the age of 20, when she began to waste away, dropping from 128 pounds to 38. She spent 8 years earning good money on the sideshow circuit and was one of the women that the skeleton dude John Coffey supposedly married. Her joints swelled and became stiff, and eventually she was unable to walk, but she carried on performing until 1898, when a man in St. Louis proposed to her, something she herself found it difficult to understand.
It does seem strange, does it not, that a big, strong man like Mr. Cole should fancy a helpless, freakish wife such as I am. I often tell him that. He only laughs and says, it does seem strange.
In a newspaper interview, she continued,
I believe he loves me and that he will care for me. If he doesn't, he can pack his pie box and git. That's all there is to it.
Sadly, Emma died just 2 months later, alone in a boarding house. Mr. Cole and his pie box nowhere to be seen. The lightest person ever listed in Guinness World Records was Rosa Lee Plemons. At the age of 18, she weighed only 27 pounds or 12 kilos. She had severe atrophy of her muscles and rigid contractures of all her major joints, and she was exhibited as an ossified person rather than a living skeleton. We know very little about her, other than a brief mention in Gould and Pyle's fascinating but slightly voyeuristic encyclopedia of the anomalies and curiosities of medicine, and that she was stolen from a dime show in McKinley, Texas in 1894. I began this exploration of the lives of people exhibiting themselves as living skeletons, hoping to find out what it felt like for them to be so different, so stared at, so at risk of being exploited. But other than a few drawings and grainy photographs and brief biographical sketches, I was unable to find any in-depth information about them at all. The most famous get a page or two in books about sideshow attractions, all saying much the same thing, but that's about it. I was also hoping to be able to suggest modern medical diagnoses, but with such little information to go on, this would be very unreliable. Living skeletons and other people with unusual disorders were of great interest to doctors in the 19th century, and studying them helped push forward our understanding of human embryology and physiology. Harvey Cushing, pioneer of brain surgery and the first person to describe the hormone disorder that bears his name, was fascinated by sideshow performers, especially the unusually tall, small and obese, befriending them and testing out the effects of growth hormones on them. Today, we would investigate these individuals for endocrine disorders, malabsorption syndromes or neurological conditions, but in the 19th century they were simply anomalies. Too weak to work, they were faced with a stark choice: allow themselves to be exhibited or starve. Anyone who has seen the moving story of the Elephant Man will remember how cruelly Joseph Merrick was exploited, and it seems likely that many of the thin people we have discussed could have been harshly treated at times. But a few at least were able to make a living, support families, and achieve a degree of dignity by creating a show rather than being the show. It's easy to condemn freak shows, putting a human being on a stand to be stared at, laughed at, married off in mock ceremonies, or made to fight it out in comedy boxing matches is deeply troubling to modern sensibilities. But as the genre was so popular and profitable, showmen were keen to attract the most striking performers to their troupes and willing to offer good money to retain them. We have to remember that being different was a dangerous thing at the time. The eugenics movement in many countries advocated for compulsory sterilisation, and in some, for euthanasia. The accounts of many of the sideshow performers talk about finding a sense of acceptance and belonging when they joined a circus, feelings they had rarely experienced before. The sideshow era may have gone, although not entirely given the popularity of American Horror Story's freak show season, but the stories of Claude-Ambroise Seurat, Isaac Sprague, John Coffey, Peter Robinson and Emma Schaller, and all the others whose names are now largely forgotten, remind us of the enduring human spirit. They remind us that behind every individual who may seem a bit different, there is a person struggling, adapting and striving to find meaning and connection in a world that sometimes does not want to accept them. Thank you for watching. This one's been a little different to my usual explorations of writers, artists and performers, so please let me know what you think. The history and ethical issues of sideshow performers are complex, sometimes uncomfortable subjects. But I believe it's important that we remember these individuals, that we remember their bravery and ingenuity with the dignity that they were so often denied in life. As always, I'd love to hear your comments and any questions you may have, and I'll try to answer as many as I can. And remember to subscribe and click for notifications to be kept up to date with all the latest releases, and then hopefully I'll see you again soon. Goodbye.